Good morning. Welcome to the February meeting of the Children and Families Scrutiny Board. My name is Councillor Alan Lamb. I represent the Wetherby Ward and I'm the chair of this board. So before we get into our agenda, what our usual custom is to go around and ask all of our board members to introduce themselves and the role that they bring to the board. So we'll go through in alphabetical order. And if I can start with Helen Bellamy, please.
Helen Bellamy, teacher representative.
Thank you, Helen. Councillor Bithell, please.
Good morning, Councillor Hannah Bithell, representing Kirkstall.
Thank you. Kate Blacker. Kate, are you there? We'll come back to Kate. I did see her on the call earlier. Tony Britton, please.
Tony Britton, representing Leeds Diocese, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Leeds.
Thank you. Callum Dixon, please.
Hi, Callum Dixon, Deputy Chair of Young Lives Leeds.
Thank you. Councillor Drinkwater.
Yeah, Paul Drinkwater, board member representing Killingbeck and Seacroft Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Flynn, please.
Good morning, Billy Flynn, Councillor for Adlam Wharfdale Ward.
Thank you. Celia Foote, please.
Morning, Celia Foote, teacher representative.
Thank you. Councillor Forsyth.
Well, good morning, Councillor Anne Forsyth, Family and Work Ward.
Thank you. Has Andrew joined us, or are we still waiting for Andrew Graham?
Chair, we're still waiting for Andrew to join us.
No problem. Thank you. Councillor Gruen, please.
Hello, everybody. Councillor Caroline Gruen. I represent Bramley and Stanningley Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Howley, please.
Chris Howley, Councillor for Weetwood Ward.
Thank you. I don't think Councillor Hussain is on the call yet, so we'll go to Councillor Illingworth.
Good morning, John Illingworth from Kirkstall Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Kidger. Councillor Kidger, are you with us? You're still muted.
Sorry about that. Councillor Kidger representing Morley South. Do apologise.
No problem, thank you. Councillor Lennox, please.
Morning, Councillor Jess Lennox representing Crossgates and Winmore.
Thank you. Councillor Marshall Cattung, please.
Good morning, everyone. Abigail Marshall Cattung representing Little London, Woodhouse and the City Centre.
Thank you. Debbie Riley, please.
Good morning, Debbie Riley, co-opted member for Children Looked After and Care Leavers.
Thank you. Councillor Renshaw.
Good morning, everybody. Councillor Karen Renshaw, representing Asling Robin Hood Ward.
Thank you very much. Councillor Stevenson.
Ryan Stevenson, representing the Harewood Ward.
Thank you. And then Jackie Ward, please.
Hi, I'm Jackie Ward. Good morning, everybody. I'm cooperative member and parent government representative for secondary schools.
Okay, thank you. And I can see Kate's got a tile, but I can't see a Kate. So I'm sure she'll get back to us at some point. So then finally, if I can ask our support officers to introduce themselves, please, starting with Angela.
Morning, I'm Angela Brogden, Principal Scrutiny Advisor.
Thank you very much. And Harriet, please.
Good morning, Harriet Spate, Governance Officer.
Thank you very much. So welcome everybody, and I will ask the officers that are joining us to introduce themselves once we get into the agenda items that are relevant to them. So we'll move straight into our agenda. So item 1, are there any appeals this morning, please?
No appeals, Chair.
Thank you. Item 2, any matters that we need to exclude the public from?
No matters to exclude the public from today, Chair. Thanks.
Thank you. Any late items?
No late items.
Thank you. Item 4, do any members have any declarations of disclosable pecuniary interests?
No.
Nope. Item 5, do we have any apologies?
No apologies, Chair.
Thank you. And then item 6 is the minutes of the previous meeting. So this is the last meeting which was on the 6th of January, which seems an awfully long time ago now, but it's not. So first of all, can we just agree that the minutes are an accurate reflection of that meeting? I'm not seeing any dissenters, so we'll take it that they are. And then there is a matter arising that I'm going to raise in a second, but does anyone else have any matters arising that aren't covered elsewhere on the minutes or on the agenda? Again, no indications. So I'm going to refer to minute 56, which is the initial budget proposals for 2021-22. And further to the last meeting, a phase 2 scrutiny statement had been produced in consultation with scrutiny chairs of all boards and now forms part of the latest budget report that's been prepared for the executive board's next meeting on the 10th of February. The report was published on the council's website yesterday and shared with board members in advance of today's meeting. What I would like to do, because there are some additional budget proposals which have now been put forward, so I'd just like Sal and Tim to just briefly confirm the current position of the Children's Services Directorate, highlighting if any additional proposals or significant changes have been made since the board considered the budget proposals last month. And then it will be for the board to ask any questions and reflect on the current position to determine whether we want to make any additional comments. So if I can hand over to Sal and then Tim, please.
Hi, morning everybody. Sal Turek, I'm Director of Children and Families. Thanks, Councillor Lamb. I think when we last discussed the budget, I think there was a question about there being a remaining gap of around £5.3 million across the savings required for the council. We at that stage made it clear that we didn't think that there would be any further contributions necessary from children and families, and I'm pleased to inform members that that indeed is the case, that we haven't put forward any additional members since that position we discussed previously. I don't know if Tim wants to add anything, or if there are any other matters of detail that need to be aired, but no significant changes since that point.
Okay, thank you, Sal. Tim, did you want to add anything?
Good morning, everybody. Tim Pouncey, Chief Officer for Resources and Strategy. No, all the proposals that we brought forward to the Scrutiny Board and the working groups remain intact. There are no new additional proposals, and there are no significant changes to any of the proposals that we have discussed. None of the additional 5.3 million directly impacts on the Children and Families budget.
Okay, thank you for that, Sal and Tim. So with that information provided, do any board members have any additional comments that they wanted to make, or any questions they want to ask about the budget at this point? I'm not seeing any hands being raised, so therefore we'll take it that our comments stand as they are. Angela will breathe a sigh of relief because that's one more piece of work she doesn't have to do. So thank you for that. And then we can move on to the main parts of the agenda. So item 7 is the coronavirus pandemic response and recovery plan update. The purpose of the item is to consider the report from the Director of Children and Families, which presents an update on the ongoing process made by Children and Families Services working with partners and communities in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The main areas that have been included in the update are the children's residential homes, children's social care and early help, early years and childcare provision, schools and shielding. So if before we get into that, if I can just invite the officers and executive members to introduce themselves, so people at home know who's talking. So if I can start with Councillor Pryor, please.
Morning, I'm Councillor Jonathan Pryor and I'm the Executive Member for Learning Skills and Employment.
Thank you. Councillor Venner, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Councillor Fiona Venner. I'm the Executive Board Member for Children and Families.
Thank you. Sal has already introduced himself, so we'll move on to Julie Longworth, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Julie Longworth and I'm Deputy Director for Children and Families.
Thank you. Similarly, Tim has introduced himself, so if you move on to Val Waite, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Val Waite. I'm Head of Learning Inclusion.
Thank you. And then Dave Clark, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dave Clark. I'm the Head of Learning Improvement.
Thank you. And then finally, Erica, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Erica Hyland. I'm a Senior School Improvement Advisor.
Okay, thank you very much. So at this point, I'll hand over to Sal and the executive members just to give us a brief introduction to the report, and then we'll move into questions and comments. So I don't know if either Councillor Venner or Councillor Pryor want to start, or straight over to Sal.
I'll start, thank you, Chair.
No problem.
So, thank you. The paper is an update of how the department is managing within the ongoing situation of the pandemic. As previously, I'd initially very much like to thank the staff for their continued absolute passion and commitment to supporting children and families in Leeds, and the flexibility and creativity that they're using to adapt services to COVID. The pandemic has continued to be a mix for children and families of business as usual and working completely differently. So children's homes, for example, are open as usual, have been all the way through the pandemic, but increasingly very challenged from the point of view of staffing when people are ill or need to self-isolate. We're still very appreciative of staff from the youth service who continue to support the staffing of our residential homes. And we're really grateful that the wonderful Rainbow House has stayed open all the way through the pandemic, providing short breaks for children with additional needs, which has been an absolute lifeline for families over the last 10 months. We've continued to have very good stability around fostering, foster families really digging in, making it work in very challenging circumstances. As is referred to in the report, we do have a challenge, which is a national challenge around finding placements for some children, particularly older children, teenagers who need to come into care and often have very complex needs. Early years are referred to in the report. We're meeting with providers very regularly. I do a regular Zoom call with large numbers of early years providers. They are open to all children, unlike schools that are closed to most children. That's elicited a range of feelings in the sector from people who are pleased to be open to a lot of staff and providers saying they don't think it's safe. That's reflected in the organisations like the Early Years Alliance that represent the sector, who've recently stated that a large number of staff, I think it was over 50% in recent research, don't feel safe at work. And I think it's fair to say there isn't scientific evidence for nurseries being open and schools being closed. Staff and Councillor Blake and I wrote a letter to ministers for the Children's Minister and Minister Zahawi, the Vaccinations Minister, on behalf of the sector, referring to the fact that our recommendation would be that the sector was closed to most children in line with schools, that the sector needs to be funded properly, which it absolutely isn't at the moment, and also that early years staff should be prioritised for vaccinations after the first 4 groups have been vaccinated as an additional group, along with teaching staff. Across the Directorate, staff are struggling as time goes on, and staff welfare continues to be an absolute priority, so staff feel valued and nurtured, and they can continue to support the children and families who very much rely on them. Child-friendly Leeds is not covered in the report, but that provides the universal offer to children and families in Leeds. I've just a couple of days ago sent an email to all members with some really helpful child-friendly Leeds and other resources, like resources that can support home learning, resources that can support families with activities, where people can get help if they need it. As you know, we're aware that children and families are struggling during this 3rd lockdown, and that's the universal offer to families that might need a bit of additional help, but not statutory or early help services. That's all my introductory comments. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Venner. Councillor Pryor, did you want to add anything at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously last time we met was just after we'd gone into lockdown. Schools had obviously had that that 1 day of mixing post Christmas, and then kind of were sent back home. I know the government were obviously under a lot of pressure to close schools at that point. Since then, we've had a number of meetings with heads and others. One key issue which has been coming up, which is highlighted in the report, is a lot of capacity at school. One common issue heads are coming back to us with is saying that the government's widening of children who can attend school has in some ways kind of meant that some elements of kind of distancing and reducing transmission has been diminished slightly. They were reporting that I think in the first week it was between 30 and 50% of children were coming into school, which is significantly higher than in the first lockdown. We did do quite a bit of work on some work with large employers in the city to try and encourage them to kind of ask their employees to keep kids at home if they could. We spoke to parents to say if that was an option, even if you're entitled to, like, please look at that, just to make it easier for schools. One thing the government did do, they said if children didn't have the necessary digital access, that made them entitled to coming to school. Now, we were delighted to learn that the government had kind of realised how significant lack of digital access was, but given the government had also slashed laptop provision previously, this was something that was very frustrating to a huge number of schools. I know a lot of wards and a lot of our councillors as well. I believe you have in Wetherby as well, Councillor Lamb, done pieces of work on getting laptops out to children, and I think that's fantastic, and that is a great role that we as councillors can fulfil. I think sadly just the need far outstrips anything we're able to do. You know, we can help, but I kind of feel sometimes we're barely touching the sides of the need out there. On exams, obviously kind of we're looking at the exams in 2021, and there's detail of that in the report. The Prime Minister did mention in his most recent address that they were starting to look at exams in 2022. Now, when we had a children's takeover of a trust board, one common theme that was coming back from young people, particularly in years 10 and 12, was a lot of anxiety about their exams for next year. Obviously, kind of those coming up to exams now, those are cancelled and they're being graded in a separate way. But those children feel they've had such a long period. It'll be 12, 18 months worth of disrupted education. So we're looking at kind of what we can do to reassure children that we are looking at this and we are seeing what we can do to mitigate that. The government obviously has talked about a catch-up fund. We don't yet know the details of that, and I think that's something we need to look at really closely, and actually perhaps it would be something that the Scrutiny Board could look at, kind of how those exams are going to be administered to make sure that they're fair and make sure that children aren't left behind. On free school meals, obviously since the last meeting there's been a lot of press about kind of the differential in provision between from some private providers around the country. Obviously in Leeds, we have Catering Leeds, which is a fantastic in-house service that's doing a fantastic job. We've also made clear that free school meal children in Leeds will be getting food over the February half term as well. Now, obviously this comes from the COVID Winter Fund, which isn't specifically for that February half term, but that's one of the things we're using it for. So I just want to offer that reassurance to parents across Leeds, because obviously that provision isn't going to be the case everywhere in the country, but it will here in Leeds. I mean, some of these issues are still going on now. Some of them have quietened down, but even only yesterday I received a letter from a chair of governors where they were still talking about that expansion of what it means to be a critical worker or a vulnerable child has meant that it is difficult to look after that number of children in school. There are still concerns that Ofsted inspections are, even though they've changed in nature, they're still putting a lot of pressure on schools. And actually what was really heartening was when the Secretary of State asked parents to complained to Ofsted about their schools, Ofsted were flooded with letters from parents saying what a wonderful job a lot of teachers and schools were doing in some of the most difficult circumstances. And it was so good to see kind of the country pulling together and actually not looking to demonise teachers en masse, which I think was fantastic. And as Councillor Venner said, in terms of vaccinations, I've also written to the vaccinations minister with a number of Councillor Blake and a number of the city's MPs, saying that after those who are most vulnerable to the most serious symptoms of COVID, we should be looking at vaccinating teachers. And there's a few reasons for this, obviously. You know, we are asking teachers to go and work on the front line in an area which the Prime Minister himself calls vectors of transmission. You know, if we're asking people to do that, it's only right that we should be offering the maximum protection. But equally, one common comment which comes back to me about the second lockdown when schools were still open was that the number of bubbles that were closing was so chaotic in schools. It put the schools at the odds with parents. Parents would then have to immediately kind of find cover and couldn't go to work. If we manage to vaccinate teachers before they go back, which given the number of teachers, you know, this won't put the vaccination programme back that much. In fact, we're vaccinating so fast that you could probably, in numerical terms, vaccinate all teachers in under a day. This would offer a lot of protection. It would offer stability to schools. It would allow learning to continue in a better way. It would protect teachers, and I just think it's so important that the government look at this. And I understand they are looking at what they do after they have vaccinated the most vulnerable. I'll leave it there for now. Obviously, I think Sal will have a few things to add, and then happy to take questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So, Sal, please.
Thanks, Councillor. Yeah, I'll just do a bit more on each of the areas. Starting with schools. I think Councillor Price covered most of it. I think part of the issue in these current restrictions was the expanded offer in terms of critical workers. So vulnerable children, we've maintained the offer to, but there were a greater number of people listed on the critical worker list, and we have had some issues there, and as Councillor Prowse explained, we've tried to support schools to manage that, because people are trying to operate safely within the confines of their particular school setting, but also to try and ensure that there's a good learning offer on a remote basis, but also on those that need teaching face to face. I think that has started to settle down, though we are still seeing some pressure in the primary schools. The secondary schools seem to be managing it, and they've also been coping with some of the testing that's necessary. So we now only need twice a week testing that is being undertaken via the schools. My understanding is that the plan is for children to be tested prior to their return to school, and as been set out, we understand that those plans about schools returning will be announced on the 22nd of February. So the first date that we expect schools to be going back on will be around the 8th of March. But obviously we are awaiting details of what that will look like so that we can work with and plan with the schools. I think the fact that there is a set out period of notice for us to get those plans in place is going to be really helpful. We've continued high levels of communication with the schools from the local authority through bulletins that we send regularly to them to assist in terms of support and guidance and coordination, but also in terms of our Zoom calls for all heads, but also at a bronze level, trying to work through some of the detail with the schools. And so I'm sure some of the issues that may well be raised are issues that have been discussed at that bronze level, and that gives us an opportunity to get into the level of detail we need to with head teachers and make suggestions about how we take things forward. In social care and early help, again, bronze group arrangements working well at a locality basis, just making sure that people are picking up issues in relation to vulnerable children. So clearly we're aware of all of those children who have a social worker, and our visits to them continue as per normal. On the whole, where there are issues, we have risk assessments that we can undertake in order to manage visits in a safe and secure way. But clearly, there are other children who are vulnerable beyond those that have a social worker, and so those localised arrangements that we put in place, both in terms of provision through our early help hubs that are in the 3 areas, but actually the conversations that happen between local professionals at a cluster level are the important ones in terms of being able to identify and ensure that we've got a plan of communicating and supporting children at a local level. I think Councillor Venner covered in detail the issues around our early years and children's centres, but from our own provision in terms of the children's centres, the vast majority of those have remained open, though there are clearly challenges there in terms of staffing and either illness related to COVID or people's close friends or relatives being ill with COVID, and those that are clinically extremely vulnerable. So that does put quite a bit of challenge into staffing numbers, as it does in children's homes. And as we've explained before, we have utilised other youth workers and staff from our Youth Justice Service who have the relevant skills and expertise to work in children's homes to help across with that. And that has been really well managed on the whole. We have had one outbreak in one of the children's homes, and again we managed that locally with public health, but also with as appropriate with government departments and public health England as well. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank all the staff that work in schools that have kept the schools running for critical and vulnerable children, critical worker and vulnerable children, and for all the staffing in all our services that out there on the front line now providing help and support to those that most need it.
Okay, thank you very much, Sal. We've got a number of people have indicated they have questions and comments, so I'll go in the order that that the hands have gone up. So we'll start with Councillor Stevenson, please.
Thank you, Chair. On vaccines, the letter that Councillor Pryor and Venner referred to, I think there's obviously going to be some sort of cross-party support here because it's sort of common sense in terms of critical workers and the role they're playing. And I think yesterday's announcement on the fact that actually Oxford vaccine can reduce transmission as well is almost a game changer. My question is, however, even though we've got one of the best vaccine rollouts in the world, supply and demand is still a problem. So bearing in mind that those over 65 are 62 times more at risk than those under 54 of fatality of COVID, and it's very easy to point out a problem, not so easy to point out a solution. My question to the Councillor Pryor or Venner is, when you wrote to the Minister asking them to prioritise key workers, did you suggest which more at-risk priority group should be pushed to one side to deliver that? Or is that something you're expecting the government to resolve on their own?
I'm happy to pick up that. I think that is something for the experts to look at. I'm not going to sit here and pretend and I'm an expert at looking at every single group and kind of make those decisions. It's my understanding that by mid-February, and this is according to the government, by mid-February, all the groups from which 95 to 99% of fatalities come from will have been vaccinated. So kind of the most vulnerable will have been vaccinated within the next fortnight. And obviously, I mean, that's the thing with statistics, when you say something is 20 times more likely, 60 times more likely, if the thing it's times by is so minuscule, then even 20 times is still small. So I'm not going to kind of say it should be done on this date, it should be done on this date, but we're doing about, I think over the weekend they did 500,000 vaccines in one day. there are fewer than 500,000 teachers and school staff in the whole country. So we're not talking about a kind of a massive delay here at all. I do think that those most at risk should be prioritised, and I think I was clear about that in the letter, and I know Councillor Venner was in her letter on early years as well. But actually, I'd make a wider comment that this vaccine rollout has been incredible. It's so impressive, and it just goes to show, you know, when the government trusts the NHS and trusts our public services to do something, they deliver. Compare that to track and trace, which was massively outsourced, and the billions wasted and huge amounts spent. And actually, I've got faith in the NHS to not only deliver to the most vulnerable, but also kind of make room for those who are at the most exposed as well.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to come back, Councillor Stevenson?
Yeah, I'll just supplement to that, because I take the point about following the advice, but the science currently states that the key priority groups next should be the phased 5 to 9, which is, as I said, the over 65s next. So under the suggestion put forward by the council, we could end up vaccinating 30-year-olds before the 65-year-olds at risk. So there is an issue there. So my question would be, if the science does say that that critical workers shouldn't be prioritised at this stage, will we therefore be accepting that? And aside from that, if the science does say that actually there is now capacity to be able to do critical workers, I'm just a bit concerned that some of the narrative we're talking about is about teachers, and we seem to be missing support staff in school as well in all that. So are we talking about everybody else, or are we just talking about teachers?
Okay, for starters, hang on, sorry, I just need to correct that. For starters, that's not what the council has said. We have not been prescriptive in when that should be. We have requested that the experts look at it. Secondly, we have not forgotten support staff. They were specifically mentioned in the letter. So we are saying this is, and when I quoted that 500,000 figure, that is 500,000 teachers and school support staff. They are all within that. And actually, we've already vaccinated some 30-year-olds ahead of some kind of 65-plus-year-olds, you know, workers in care homes and in the NHS, because there was a recognition that those who are most exposed are vulnerable too, as well as those at greatest risk of infection. We've already recognised that within the system. We're requesting that a similar view is taken towards some other people on the front line. I mean, no one would argue that we shouldn't have vaccinated NHS staff and care home staff, first of all. No one's arguing that, but we're saying we want the same argument to be applied to other frontline workers.
If I could just add to that, I think Councillor Pryor was really clear in his first answer that creditably the vaccine rollout is going so well that vaccinating teaching staff and early years staff is not going to significantly delay other people getting the vaccine. But there's also an issue of people having confidence in those settings and those settings being able to run smoothly. As Councillor Pryor referred to, we had constant bubble collapses when schools did go back, which made teaching incredibly difficult. In order for parents to have the confidence to send children back to school and for those schools to run smoothly, this feels really important. And with early years staff, I mean, they're working with all children. Early years settings are not close to most children, as I referred to. It's in the DfE guidance that early years staff don't wear PPE unless they're working with COVID positive children, because it could cause distress to babies and small children if they're masked, for example. And they're obviously doing very personal care of small children, you know, wiping noses, giving cuddles, etc. And the Early Years Alliance, as I said, have reported that half their staff have said they don't feel safe at work. So it's also about the confidence of people who work in those settings and people who send their children to them that will enable schools and early years settings to function more smoothly once all settings are open to all children. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Illingworth is next, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. like to endorse what's already been said, no point in repeating it again. But one factor which I think we haven't paid attention to is the length of time it takes immunities to develop. And so if we are going to vaccinate teaching staff, a move which I would, and support staff, strongly support that move, it's important it's done quickly enough for the vaccination to be effective before people return to school. Otherwise, we're going to have a repetition of what happened on early January. And not a good outcome. So I think we should be pressing for early action on this. And as Jonathan has said, it can all be done in a day or just over. It needn't hold the rest of the programme up very much at all.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Illingworth. Did anyone want to come back on that? It's more of a comment than a question, I think. So if we go on to Councillor Gruen, please.
Thank you. And just with respect to the last debate, it's school staff, isn't it? It's not just teachers and support teachers, it's cleaners and catering staff and everybody who works in a school who is in that same vulnerable position. I just wanted to comment really on 3 themes. First of all, you touched on staff anxiety in schools. And I'm sure that's right. I'm feeling that a lot at the schools where I'm a governor. And there are parallels, I believe, with the anxiety and depression that has been recognised within the NHS staff. And a very considerable resource has been put into Leeds teaching hospitals via its charity, actually, for giving mental health support and psychological support to all staff in hospitals, cleaners through to consultants, who've been very grateful for that resource. And I'm just wondering if we've got to the point where we need to think about putting some kind of resource into schools for staff who are beginning to feel under pressure and anxious about the situation that they're in. And I would also say that at this point in the pandemic, it is becoming evident, isn't it, that children are beginning to feel anxious and depressed as a result of really not being able to socialise in the way they're programmed to do. And have we thought about how we might begin to address that, both now and as we come out of the pandemic in due course as well? I wanted to comment on the virtual curriculum offer as well, which I think is much improved from the first lockdown. And I think teachers have worked so hard along with their support staff to provide live virtual lessons. I'm sure the quality across the city varies, but certainly the experience I've had as a governor is that the lessons of the most extraordinary quality are becoming available on a live basis. The problem with that, of course, is that not all children have access to computers, so or suitable devices, so they're not all having experiences of the same quality. But I'm just wondering whether education staff here have a view about attendance, because although there is an opportunity to have a full day's schooling of a very reasonable quality, if not high quality now, the attendance rate at the schools that I'm aware of is only just over 50%. And I'm wondering if we need to think about that as an issue. And finally, a virtual visit to the children's home I'm linked to as a corporate parent yesterday did remind me of the extreme pressure that staff in those homes are under as well. We touched on the homes earlier on. It is extremely challenging, isn't it, to have the children at homes in those homes all of the time, again with no real opportunities for socializing outside that, and for limited opportunities of going to other places. So have we begun to think about the pressures there and how we might address them? Thank you.
Okay, there's quite a few things to cover there. Sal, shall we go to you first and then you
so
can direct it from there?
Sure. So if I ask Dave and Erica, if necessary, to come in on the children remote learning, please. Children struggling with mental health issues. I think Val and Julie could pick that up. Julie can pick up children's homes, and then the anxiety of school staff and how they're dealing with that, Dave, as well, please. Dave, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, thanks, Shal. In terms of the staff anxiety, Councillor Gruen, we've got a number of initiatives going on in terms of supporting school staff. We had an online session which 50 leaders attended in terms of support for mental health and well-being of their staff, and we're doing all we can to encourage more school leaders to get involved, and it's about supporting how they support their staff within school with their mental health and well-being. So that's been taking place. I know Val's team is working alongside our health and well-being service in terms of a range of initiatives to support both staff well-being and also children's mental health well-being. And I know that Councillor Pryor mentioned earlier about the young people's takeover of the Children's Trust Board, and I think that was a big theme about and their views on how the mental health of young people is being affected, and that's going to be for the Youth Parliament and the Children's Trust Board and those voice and influence groups to actually work to enhance all the offers available to support children and young people's mental health going forward, because you're absolutely right, it is an increasing issue within schools and settings. In terms of virtual learning, you're absolutely right in terms of schools are doing, they're much more prepared for virtual learning, doing some really good work, and we've been supporting in terms of providing resource links and an offer to schools that they can tap into to support them with their remote learning. I think it's one of the things in terms of the engagement. You know, can I just clarify? You know, when you said 50% attendance, do you mean 50% of the children that are at home that could potentially be doing the live?
Yes.
Learning?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do. Yeah.
So I think schools are very aware of that, and there's a certain amount of concern from them of how they engage those young people that are not taking place online. So they're still providing, and we've sent some information out to school leaders and to parents and to governors to remind them that remote offer isn't just live learning, and it doesn't have to just be online. There's a whole raft of different strategies that they use to ensure that young people are engaged, and some of the online stuff is brilliant, but there's actually other ways that can be done. So I think schools are trying to find that the best way to make sure that all children are engaged, whether it's online or virtual, and also increasing the amount of young people have access to that digital device. Just it might be worth just saying at this point, Councillor Green, that we've had the latest figures from the DFE scheme. So we've had into maintained schools, we've had there's been about 8,678 digital devices sent for children to use. And another 8,600 that's gone into academies. Now, we're not quite sure whether that's all these children in the academies, because those academies are wider than just Leeds. But so there's been significant investment in devices into schools. Lots of schools telling us yesterday at our meeting with school leaders that they're accessing more and more devices themselves. So they're accessing one-to-one funding to provide more devices. So I think there's a long way to go on that, but more and more children are having access to that online. And then one of our next bronze meetings with primaries in particular is to look at the engagement of young people and how we make sure that all children, regardless of online or not, are engaged in their learning as best as possible. Because actually, you know, we've said before, 6 hours of live streaming, if it's not high quality, the children are often better with, if there's different ways of doing it. If there's 3 hours of real high quality engagement, that's better than just the time spent on it. So hopefully that answers your question, but I think Val will probably be able to pick up a bit more on the mental health and well-being.
Well, I'll just come back on the digital devices. I mean, the fact is that currently we still have children who are either sharing a device or using a phone. And the experience just isn't the same. I mean, two siblings who can't both be in lessons at the same time is not a satisfactory position. So I think this is quite an urgent issue. And what you've said to me is there are intentions and it's getting better, but actually that gap still exists.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is still a gap, and we've been doing a survey at the moment, which is live. We've got about we've got about a third of our schools have responded, and I'm just trying to look. We've got so far schools are telling us we have about 4,500 young people without access, and that's just bearing in mind that on the schools that have responded to us, 4,500 young people that haven't got access to that digital device that's not a smartphone, or they're not having to share it. So yeah, there is still that digital divide gap there, and it is an issue. Schools are trying to work through that to find, to access more devices. And I know, like Councillor Pryor said, lots of work going on from councillors and from social enterprise groups and business links with schools to try and access more laptops and devices for them. But it's certainly a priority in terms of improving the amount of young people. And actually, I think it's certainly an issue that it's not just for this pandemic. I think long term is an issue that we can carry on doing that. So the digital divide, and I think our colleagues in 100% Digital Leeds are using this as an opportunity to carry on that work post pandemic, so that actually, if anything like this happens in the future, then actually they can, we're not in that situation with young people without access.
Okay, Val, are you going to come in on some of the other points?
Yes, if you don't mind. Thank you, Councillor Lamb.
Thank you.
Just in terms of the mental health issues that you raised, Councillor Gruen, absolutely, couldn't agree more. There is a real need and a real focus for the support for children and for the staff that are working within those settings. We got a grant that was from central government that was the Wellbeing for Education grant, and that has been coordinated by our principal educational psychologist. So all of the psychologists have been undertaking training for staff, and that not only is about the well-being of young people, but also about self-care as well for the staff themselves. What they then have been doing is also working within the clusters and working with the colleagues that are within the clusters to support those colleagues, having meetings both within the cluster and group sessions that are facilitated by the educational psychologists to support the rolling out of that training, the DFE training on the well-being of young people, and also to support the staff themselves in supporting the young people. And I think that it's that whole picture, isn't it, and that full circle that is really important, that it is the staff that within the schools that are in the daily contact with all of those young people and their families that are doing that direct support, and then it's the staff themselves that need that encouragement, that support, acknowledgement in what they are doing, so that they can absolutely focus the right and appropriate kinds of support and signposting where necessary, where difficulties might become more entrenched, as well as then the actual well-being of the staff themselves. So all that has been ongoing over this last period of time. We have had over 150 specific delegates from the individual schools that have been trained in the wellbeing programme for themselves and for the support of their staff. We've also done the recorded training now that's on YouTube, so that it can be accessed for people that didn't manage to actually get into the live training itself. We've also worked with colleagues on the whole of the MindMate agenda and the Future in Mind strategy, where we have spoken to young people. Young people have been absolutely fantastic during this period, and they provide blogs themselves where they have been able to talk to other young people, where they've talked about their own personal circumstances, and then the mechanisms and the strategies that they have put in place that have supported them and shared that knowledge, shared that learning. And some of the blogs have been absolutely fantastic, and some of those individual experiences that have now been shared online. So it was about pulling in all of those young people, peer support, because we know that that is one of the best ways of supporting young people. They tell us what they need, they tell us what it should look like, and then they themselves share it with other people. In terms of just a little bit, just on attendance, just to link in with Dave as well, because of course we have got attendance for critical workers, vulnerable children, in terms of all of those children with education, health and care plans, and particularly those that are in our most specialist settings. What we have done is we have linked in with every family that's within a specialist setting and worked out with that family the best personalised programme for them. So some of it means absolute physical attendance at school, maybe not 5 days a week, because what they have worked through is it might be better actually to reduce the numbers of young people actually within a setting at any one time that they would attend on particular days. And then they would access other remote learning, whether it's the streaming from the actual school itself, or whether it is packages of support that's going into that home, or accessing particular therapies. So they have worked with the families to co-produce a package of support for each family. So some of the attendance figures that you see that are reported back through the DFE reporting system will only be a snapshot really of the average attendance on any particular day, not the overall picture of how many young people within that cohort are engaged and physically attending some of the provisions throughout that week. So on one day you'll get a picture of maybe around 30–40% attending, but when you look across the whole of the special school cohort, you'll see that it's around 70% of young people that are actually physically attending at some part of that week. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that, Val. Julie, did you want to come in to mop up?
Yes, please. Thank you, Councillor Lamb. I suppose I'll just start or follow on from Val in terms of children's mental health and emotional well-being. We had an absolutely fantastic session last week where children, young people from right across the city came and took over the Children and Families Trust Board, and they told us personally, they shared their own experience of the impact of COVID and in particular the sort of relationship between COVID and their education and how that had impacted them. They talked about transition. You know, some young people described leaving school last year, leaving year 11. You know, and ordinarily there would have been huge celebrations and young people being able to get together. Those rites of passage, really. And they talked, well, you know, really honestly about how that had impacted on them, you know, and how that had made them feel. They talked about just the importance of individual teachers just checking in. Just you know, lifting up the phone, giving them a little call, and how much they appreciated that. They did talk about the importance, as Val has mentioned, about peer support, but actually really valuing when that was enabled for them. So as part of the school day, you know, to be put in groups and to have sort of space within the timetable, if you like, albeit even if, you know, virtually, to get together. But what they did say was that sometimes they are put in groups with children that they don't know. So actually they don't feel that they're not going to have an open conversation or really share about how they feel if they don't know those children. So they were sort of saying, you know, it'd be great, that's absolutely fantastic, but could we be put with children that we know? They also talked about actually some really great examples of where some schools had actually set aside a day to focus on social, emotional, mental health, and actually structured it. So really encourage the young people to do things for themselves, you know, so to set an hour aside to speak to a friend, to set an hour aside to go for a walk, and actually how that had been really useful. What we've done is we've scooped up all of that rich feedback from those young people, and we've shared it with Val and Dave, and actually that's going to be shared with the bronze groups, because it is about listening to the voice of children and young people, and then us developing our practice with colleagues in schools to reflect that and to take their ideas on board. Also, you know, as Val has said, at a local level, at a cluster level, we're now tracking children, our social work teams, our early help staff, our family support staff and targeted services leads in schools, because it's about, I suppose, taking that proactive approach, you know, we're not waiting until a young person is really in need, but being able to prevent that and take that preventative approach. So there really is that line of sight on individual children. Val's talked about the relationships that we've got with My Mate Spa, with GPs, you know, so it really is that team around the child. I'll just move on to our residential children's homes, and absolutely, Councillor Gruen, you know, in terms of our duty of care to our staff and also the duty of care to our children, you know, it's something that we are taking extremely seriously, and we have done since, you know, since day one. There's a range of formal, I suppose, you know, and informal support. So if I think about the informal support, it really is about looking out for each other and creating a culture, again, where, you know, at its simplest, where people are kind to each other, where people are recognising if a colleague is struggling a little bit or is, you know, tired, or if there's personal circumstances going on. So it's creating that culture of a caring, compassionate environment. We've encouraged things like breakfast meetings, virtual lunches, again encouraging people to be able to create a space for people to be able to come together just to talk, in the same way that we've heard from young people, we hear the same from our staff, just the opportunity to come together and share how they're feeling with trusted colleagues. We've also had a range of academic lectures which have been available to our staff. We've had external speakers come in, really focusing on, and again, sharing good practice, sharing ideas about how we can look after our own mental health and well-being. We have also, I suppose, moving into perhaps some of the more formal processes, you know, we have individual risk assessments, as we know, you know, for individual settings. We have put in place formal wellbeing discussions with every individual right across the directorate, you know, so to create a formal space where that conversation can take place. We have individual risk assessments for individuals. So if we know that we have a member of staff who may have some personal circumstances, you know, that we need to take account of, then we've also got recourse to look at an individual risk assessment for those individuals, involve our occupational health colleagues to ensure that we're doing everything that we can to support them in the workplace. And we also have our help service, so that's a confidential support service, and staff from right across the directorate can access that. They access that confidentially, so their managers don't know, their colleagues don't know. They can have, I think it's up to about 6 sessions initially with a counsellor. So really to have an opportunity to talk about their own well-being and perhaps how the COVID pandemic is impacting on that. So there's a whole range of support. It's not static, again, because we're constantly listening to the feedback from our staff and trying to revise that, you know, so that we are responding to the needs. And I'll leave it there, but thank you very much, Councillor Lamb.
Okay, thank you for that, Julie. Councillor Gruen, you've had some pretty comprehensive responses there. Are you happy that all your questions have been answered?
Yes, thank you. It's been very comprehensively covered. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. So next on the list, I have Helen Bellamy, please.
Thank you. First, just to point out and kind of acknowledge how hard children's services are working and adapting constantly to the changing environment. And then also, I've got a question for Councillor Venner, and then a couple of comments that follow up on points that Councillor Pryor and Dave made. Firstly, Councillor Venner, are there numbers for children who are attending nurseries who have CV family members at home, and is there support in place for those children to work from home or learn from home? Just a comment around catch-up. I am concerned that catch-up money will be used to, under direction from the government, for less experienced teachers to provide catch-up. And I think, as somebody with years of experience in teaching, you know, I would not be equipped to provide that if I were in my first or second year of teaching. It is a skill to be able to work with a child that you don't know well or don't know at all. It is a real skill to be able to make that catch up really matter. And if it doesn't, if you haven't got that skill, that it bothers me that money will be wasted and that learning time will be wasted. And then to Dave, I do, and also other members of the council, I do acknowledge that, you know, it's a good thing to be able to provide support for, not only for children but for staff in school for their mental health, and obviously staff's mental health is inextricably linked to children and how they feel in school, because they pick up very quickly on how staff are, and they need to feel secure when they're in school or when they're learning from home with staff. But I am concerned that there are schools that still have, some schools that still have all staff in, or schools that have all teaching assistants in and teachers at home, and that you know, not having that parity of protection. As well, I would like to acknowledge that there are schools that are doing their absolute best to hold that line, and where they're confident that children can work from home, or that key worker parents can work from home, and carers, that they are, you know, insisting that that happens where it can happen. And that, you know, there are MATs like Owlcoats, Brigshaw, that are really doing that, and special schools that we've had experience of. But just to go back to the point, you know, there are still schools that we are concerned about where more staff than we feel is necessary are in.
Okay, thank you. So if I go to Councillor Venner first and then to Dave, please.
Thank you. Yes, we have a list of children who are clinically extremely vulnerable. From my memory, Julie or Sal, correct me if I'm wrong, we have nearly 1,000 children, between 900 and 1,000 children in the city who are on that list and are therefore advised not to be either at school or in early years settings. Because we have details of those children, we are able to provide them with the support that they need, whether that's access to making sure they do have learning and education opportunities, making sure that the families have the support they need, like if they're struggling to access food and supplies for babies and children, then we can support with that through social work and through our early help hubs. As I mentioned in my introductory comments, Rainbow House has been open all the way through for children who need respite and short breaks at weekends, which has been just fantastic. They're open. They really have been open all the way through, which has been a lifeline for a lot of families. I'm having regular meetings with some groups of parents with children with additional needs who are aware it's been an incredibly challenging time for families who've got children who are clinically vulnerable and or have additional needs. So the department is making sure we're doing everything we can to support them. But yes, we do have, because we know who the children are who are clinically vulnerable and who can't attend early years or school settings, we are able to make sure they're getting educational input. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Dave, did you want to come in on the next round? Helen, did you want to come? So I think Helen just wants to come back on
Yeah,
that response.
if I could just say, the question was more, Councillor Venner, about children who have family members who are CEV, so they're attending nursery, but there are vulnerable family members at home. Are they being supported to learn at home? So the children themselves are not clinically extremely vulnerable, but they're living in homes with family members who are.
Are you referring to school or early years?
Early years, sorry.
I'm not actually able to answer that. I don't know if Julie could pick that up from our own Little Owls setting.
Yeah, I think perhaps what you may be asking, Helen, is for families who have family members who are CEV and so who perhaps don't feel able to send their children into nursery. Are we supporting those children to stay home? So the answer is absolutely yes. So we have a range of online resources that we've made available to those families. We also have virtual support groups, again, online support groups that those families can access as parents and carers. We've also actually provided a range of physical materials and physical resources that we have actually delivered to family homes, so actual doorstep delivery, which has given us an opportunity to have some socially distanced check-in where that's been possible. So there's been an absolute range of activity, again, via the children's centres, via our outreach workers, via our consultant teachers who have informed those, the development of those resources, and the cluster staff has already been mentioned. So, you know, and as Councillor Venner has said again, you know, they are by the nature that those children are at home and living with a parent or a parent who is vulnerable, you know, they are absolutely in our line of sight.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. So, Dave, did you want to come in then, please?
Yes, brilliant. Thanks, Councillor Lamb and Helen. Yeah, I think the school leaders and governors have had a real challenge in terms of balancing the number of staff and students within their school, and in terms of this new lockdown, significantly higher numbers of children have been have come into school through the extended critical worker definitions, and also like higher numbers of vulnerable children that have been coming into school. So they had to find that real balance, and I think we've supported schools in terms of trying to get that right balance. So I think initially lots of heads, because it came at such a fast pace, within like a couple of days they had to have put these arrangements in place. They pretty much, school leaders were telling us that they pretty much needed people in school whilst they then sorted out and put arrangements in place. And then I think a lot of schools have been able to, and school leaders have been able to like reassess that with their risk assessment, and then like decide, not necessarily need all their staff in school. However, what we've had a number of discussions about this with trade union colleagues over the last few weeks, and health and safety, because the information when we've discussed with school leaders, they've utilised their risk assessment to actually make the right decisions for their setting, for their unique setting. So, for example, because there's more children, and because there's, been a much more of a call for children working in smaller groups, they've got to have the right number of staff available to actually manage all that within school. So, what we have said is that that actually, where possible, and the messaging coming from the local authority out to their school leaders and governors is that actually, where at all possible, staff that don't need to be in school don't need to be in school, and we've supported them in terms of reducing the numbers of places that have been requested, so that actually they can manage that. What we have said, and like you say, health and safety teams and our teams have had those conversations with schools, and every time we've had those discussions, their decision making has been quite justified. It's been very justified in terms of why they've got the numbers of people in school. What we have said, and we sort of reiterated that with union colleagues when we met them in the week, if there are very specific cases, we're very happy to have to look at those, and to sort of like have those discussions with health and safety colleagues and say, like, is there any other options that you can consider? So I appreciate where you're coming from, Helen, but I guess heads are in that really challenging position at the moment in terms of managing high numbers of young people in schools, but also having to provide high levels of expectations for remote learning, and how to manage all those expectations in a really challenging situation.
Yeah, so if I can just say, I totally understand that, and I know that a lot of heads are really following the council's information and direction and doing their absolute best, but there are some instances where we have staff who are reporting different scenarios than head teachers seem to be coming back to the council, which is difficult.
Yeah, and I think in those cases, particularly if they if they maintain, Helen, that we've sort of said that if people like come back to us and we can talk about those and look at those individually and see if there's anything that is specific that we can look at.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Celia is next, please.
Thank you. Yes, I'm aware from meetings with early years and the like that quite a number of staff have been off ill with the virus. I'm concerned that there could be some long-term effects, and are we putting anything in place for subsequent sickness absence management? I believe we call it long COVID. It seems very similar to the post-viral syndrome. And in addition to sort of add to what Helen's been saying, yeah, there is some absolutely wonderful guidance coming out from the local authority. Equally, I think we're hearing about schools who clearly aren't following that guidance and definitely not following the spirit of it. But I think they're outside the local authority's sphere of influence in that they're academies. So this is possibly more for the councillors, but certainly I know the officers do speak to the DfE, and it's those academies that are putting an awful lot of pressure on school staff. The situation whereby teachers and support staff are in a classroom physically teaching face to face and having to run online streaming as well and check up on those pupils and make sure that they're attending and mark different registers is having quite a big impact. Now, where the MATs or cooperate with the local authority, I guess they're the ones that are following your guidance as much as possible. But I do think something needs raising with the DfE about sometimes what appear to be very maverick styles of managing this way of teaching. And then finally, just a point for Val. Do you process the education and healthcare plans for academies? Because there seems to, and this is purely, from inquiries, a couple of inquiries, there seems to be a slowing down of processing them in academies, or at least that's what certain members are being told. Thanks.
Shall I come in terms of the early years question specifically? Would that help?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so absolutely, we have seen an increase in staff who have tested positive in our early years settings. And it's absolutely right as well that we have seen, I think across the board really, where individuals are testing positive, that whereas perhaps sort of before Christmas, earlier last year, people were returning to work quite quickly after that initial isolation period. But it's quite right to say that we have seen and we are seeing the impact of, again, it's being termed long COVID, but people just struggling really to fully recover. So we're very, very mindful of that. Again, we're having those individual conversations, those wellbeing discussions. We're involving our occupational health colleagues, as you would expect, where we feel that that is necessary. We're also encouraging our staff, we're aware that there are COVID clinics now, individual GPs, as an example, really sort of developing their own knowledge around long COVID. So I suppose just to reassure, councillors and colleagues on the call that, again, it is something that we're very focused on, both in terms of our health and safety, our HR colleagues and our occupational health, and in dialogue with the staff that are affected themselves. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Councillor Lamb.
I'll just add to that, obviously, aside from those particular challenges, we are really conscious about the sustainability of the sector as a whole. And so the communication that we are having with them in terms of regularised information, but also the Zoom calls, is about that relationship that we want to build with those providers, because we're going to need them into the future, and so we are trying to support them as much as possible so that there is a sustainable future for early years and childcare providers. That's that continues to be a mixture of some of our own provision, but largely it will be some of that private provision and some of the provision that comes through the schools. I guess on your other points, Celia, again, I mean, we are in regular dialogue with the Department for Education. I think it has varied over a period of time, and at the moment I think it's settling down to twice a week that I'm having conversations with them. it's important to remember that the overall, what the government has asked for local authorities is to try and provide coordination and support to all schools, no matter what their structure is. But clearly, where there are issues, particularly with academies, the DfE do tend to pick those up directly, but are in conversation with ourselves. We've tried to take an approach that is really about the whole school system in Leeds. Being very open and encouraging of schools, no matter what the overarching structure is, and very engaged in conversation. Using learning from a variety of settings for the rest of the service. All the Zoom calls and the bronze calls we have are open to all schools, so that there is proper dialogue right across the system that kind of gives us much more of a coordinated and a Leeds approach, really, no matter what school background you come from. But obviously, in terms of how much we are able to then influence, that's dependent on the relationships that we have, and we are working hard on making those as positive as possible. However, if there are particular issues, I think, as Dave said, then we are happy to pick those up and have a look at those on an individual basis and have the initial conversations. Where DfE are getting involved from information that they pick up, they do tend to let us know that they're having those conversations, so there is a bit of a coordination back and forth, and would be happy to raise any specific issues if needed.
Thank you. Val, did you want to come in as well? I saw your hand was up.
Yeah, just to comment on what Celia was raising in terms of education, health and care plans. Yes, the local authority process all of the plans, whether a young person is within an academy or a local authority maintained school. The request comes into the local authority. Just between August and January of this year, we've had 352 new requests that have come in, and that actually is about the norm from previous years. So we're not seeing really an increase or decrease. We had anticipated that there will be an increase, but probably not within this first term, because if you consider that so many children have not physically been in school, and that within the code of practice there is a requirement that each and every school must put in place a graduated approach for each learner. So really the early help initiative. So they would have to put in place strategies and structures to enable that young learner to actually engage and to make progress within their learning before they request an education, health and care plan. So we are anticipating there may well be a rise, but a lot of the work we are doing at the moment is supporting schools in identification of need and then putting that early intervention package in place through that graduated approach. But as I say, the numbers at the moment are about the same as they have been in previous years.
Okay, thank you for that. So next I have got Councillor Howley, please. And if I could just, we've got about 15 minutes left on this item. So if I could, there's still a few people to come in. So if you could just encourage questions and comments to be as brief as you can, and similarly with responses, please. So Councillor Howley, please.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to revisit very briefly, notwithstanding what's just been said, this issue of digital equipment resource in schools. I suspect the figures in the report do miss a large proportion of the problem. I am aware of families, for example, who have been provided with equipment which isn't fit for purpose and are having to go back and resort to using mobile phones. And I suspect circumstances like that aren't picked up in the figures. I suspect schools, the council, everybody involved has done a fantastic job of trying to provide equipment in very difficult circumstances when it was unexpected. I am heartened by the fact that Dave said we need a long-term approach to this. And I would like it to remain on the agenda that we do need long-term provision. We need a strategic approach to it. Now the firefighting can stop, and actually we need IT support for those families using equipment as well. So if there are any further brief comments, we've had a lot of debate on that already, I'd appreciate them, but I would like to emphasise those points. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Howley. So I think Councillor Pryor and Erica have indicated they'd like to come in on that.
Yeah, it's just about a brief comment on the points Councillor Howley made about the need. So we're working with a number of third sector organisations at the moment, whereby kind of we gather donations from individuals and organisations. They go to these charities who do the technical wiping and reinstalling a new operating system, which all has to be done for safeguarding purposes. Obviously, we can't just pass on second-hand stuff. They do a level of wiping which is more than just, I know on some computers you can do like a factory reset. They do something like the next step up. We've just done a school survey where about a third of the schools came back, and the need across about a third of schools was around for 3,000 devices. So, you know, if that third is representative of the city as a whole, that means there's around a need for about 9,000 devices across the whole city, which it was the point I made before, kind of where you know, it is the right thing to be doing, to be for us as a council and as individual councillors to be working to correct some of this. But when the need is that great, there's just so much more to be doing, which makes it that more disappointing that the government has slashed that laptop provision. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And Erica, did you want to come in as well on this?
I don't really need to add anything because I think Councillor Pryor said what I would have done. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you very much. Okay, so next we have Councillor Forsyth, please.
Right, thank you very much, Chair, and I'll be quite brief because Celia Foote has already brought up what I wanted to say about, it seems at the moment sort of anecdotal evidence about the long COVID. That of course links with the real need for, you know, our teachers in schools to get the vaccination, and we had the debate earlier about whether that should be, you know, in preference to the, say, 65+-year-olds. But so I really want to just come back to say, is there any grasping of sort of how much of a problem that is likely to be going forward, really? And that also relates, of course, to the sort of anxiety issue for staff in schools, because some people are suffering from COVID, either not at all really, but the long COVID is really, I think, something we haven't really grasped yet. So I don't know if there's any need to be any much more comments about that. A very specific question though is, in terms of, if you like, catch up, it's the year 12s who are really, if they're very much concerned about, you know, the end of their year 13 and their A levels, and they've already missed out on their GCSE grades, how much are they, in specifically that year group specifically, being sort of looked at? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Dave, are you the best person to pick that up?
Or maybe me.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, I mean, if Erica comes in on that, Councillor Forsyth, but just in terms of the long COVID, there have, you know, HR teams are starting to look at that whole issue of long COVID, and I think until, you know, it's going to be a national issue, isn't it, to look at in terms of the impact and the effects of that. And I think there's very little known about it at the moment, but I guess that's on the radar of one of the things in terms of implications, not just for schools, but for councils, for nationally, that's going to be a big implication going forward. So I guess there's nothing, like you say, further to add on that at the moment, but it's there on the radar. And I wonder if Erica, do you want to pick up on the year 12 and the catch-up issue?
Yes, Councillor Forsyth, I 100% agree with you, because I speak to you as a professional and a year 12 child. I think this is entering the consciousness much more at the moment, because there's been the focus on what will we do for exams for year 11 and year 13, but there's a recognition that the lost learning for the current year 10 and the current year 12 is extremely extremely problematic. Government are looking at that and they're taking advice from key teachers unions like the ASCL to inform that position. And of course, just as we have with the consultation that's just taken place, we'll contribute to any consultation about what that would look like. When we did the survey of the schools about digital devices, one slightly reassuring aspect of it was that the older that the children get, the more likely it is that they have devices. Now, whether that's because schools have prioritised the older children for devices, or whether that is a sad indictment of children who carry on in education and their relative affluence, I don't know. But certainly children in year 12, well, when we asked about year 12, there's a lot more, very few children do not have, there are very few children who do not have access to a device or to the internet. So the reassuring thing is that they are actually accessing live streaming learning a lot more than some of the other year groups. And also that tends to, from what we know at the moment, that seems to be the preferred method of delivery for children in older age groups, that they are receiving live learning from secondary schools, particularly at post-16. We also have a post-16 network, which is focusing on lost learning at the moment, to support post-16 leaders in the city on that particular area. I would say perhaps it's one of the foci is not just on lost learning, but lost experience. So one thing that children are reporting back to us is their anxiety that they're not picking up the range of work experience that they might, which would support their university applications, and they're not actually getting to visit universities, so that they feel that they may well be in the position where they would actually have to apply to a university without ever having visited it and have a sense of whether that would be suitable for them. And a lot about post-16 is those wraparound enrichment activities which develop the whole person, and schools are struggling to replicate that. So those are issues that we are actually focusing on for year 12 as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Erica. So we've got Kate next, please.
Thanks. I'll try and be really quick. My question was actually about the live streaming of lessons. So obviously, I think schools are doing an amazing job, and I'm hugely sympathetic towards them and staff, all staff in schools. And obviously aware that there's been increasing numbers of children in school due to the widening of the vulnerable, the key worker category. But I think in part, obviously, parents experience first time round what it was like to homeschool children. And I suspect that more parents this time have sent their children into school because of the difficulties of obviously managing work with homeschooling, but also concerns around their children's emotional well-being and the lack of opportunity for socialisation the longer this goes on. And just speaking from personal experience, I have one child who has had the benefit of online lessons and another where it's a different arrangement. And we've touched on variants of the home learning experience. And I think it really does vary quite widely. And I think that has in part probably influenced parents' decisions about whether they can manage to keep children at home or not. So my question is around what the council's sort of view and advice has been to schools about the provision of online lessons, to what extent that's practical, and to what extent schools are able to deliver that. But in particular, I think some schools have said that they don't feel able to provide that for safeguarding reasons, whereas other schools are providing it. And I think because it's really quite significant in terms of the experience for children and families, and obviously staff as well. I'm just curious to understand to what extent schools are being encouraged, discouraged, supported or not supported to provide live online stream lessons, because I think that could potentially impact on the numbers of children that you would actually see coming into school. So that was one of my questions. And the other one, really quickly as well, was have we considered sort of the transition experience for the children this year moving in from primary school or high school into new provisions, and based on the experience of children last year? Because again, from personal experience of that, I think that's really hard for children to miss that sort of rite of passage and to move on. And what additional support can we provide to those year groups, knowing what we know now from last year? And then, sorry, really quickly on vaccines, absolutely agree that we should prioritise school staff, all school staff. But I just wondered about children and young people in residential settings. I don't know to what extent, particularly maybe learning disabled children, I don't know to what extent they're being impacted in terms of not being able to have contact with family members. That's been some of that in the news and things. And I just wondered to what extent we've considered those children and prioritisation for them as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Erica, you've indicated that you'd like to respond on that one.
Are you, Dave, are you happy for me to respond, or you want to come in first?
Yeah, if I just wanted to say, you know, that Kate, with schools, it's very much for the schools initially to decide what they can provide. So they've been working hard to assess, and it's going back to that unique situation that they find themselves in terms of their staff capacity, their staff training, what platform they've got. You know, lots of schools have got a more advanced platform now than the previous lockdown. So there's a lots of factors that come into play when they're deciding what their offer can be. So schools have now been required to publish online what they can offer to schools, and I think from our discussions with head teachers, it's developing all the time in terms of what they can offer and how best they can offer that to their children and their families. In terms of the safeguarding, there's a real fine balance with the safeguarding, because there are, with most things online, there's issues to do with safeguarding. And in terms of us supporting schools, so we've very much we sent out last week just pretty much an overview of all the different considerations that school leaders and governors need to take into account when they're setting up live streaming. You know, because I mean, people will have heard about the new we've got the term sort of like Zoom bombing at the minute, which is where people come in unannounced, and they'll be, you know, so there's all sorts of, with anything technological, there's always something that comes up to cause issues. So we've given like a list of things for school leaders to consider, and it's quite considerable about sort of staff workload, about safeguarding, about how to keep the staff protected, you know, information and expectations on parents and what they invite, you know. So I think there's a lot to consider, and actually one of the key things is in terms of the live streaming, to make it effective and safe, staff need to be confident and comfortable and trained with it, you know. Otherwise, that's where things can go wrong. And so actually some schools are still in the process of setting things up and actually delivering training with their staff. Do you see? So they're all at different stages, I guess. And I think, so in terms of, you know, you asked whether we were encouraging it. We're encouraging schools to deliver the best offer that they can, during that mix of online, not online, work packs, all sorts of things, and to carry on developing their offer. And we're putting support in from our teams where we can. And the other thing that we're doing is we're starting to share good practice. So yesterday on the Zoom call, one of the primary head teachers was talking about some of the good work that they were doing. So we can facilitate that sharing of good practice of how schools can roll out high quality live streaming. So Erica, is there anything that I've missed out on that bit?
I think the only thing I would add, Dave, is that one of our jobs really is to scan the research that's going on, and in particular Ofsted and the Education Endowment Fund have both published papers recently about remote education. And really there were two conclusions, and conclusion number one is that quality of delivery is much more important than the means of delivery. So actually you can have live streaming that's poor, you can have live streaming that's fantastic, you can have a really good textbook and no live streaming that's just as good as, which would be more valuable than poor live streaming. So that's one consideration. And the other major consideration is that it has to align to the curriculum. So last year there was most schools were very much engaged on developing the quality of their curriculum, so it hung together really well, that learning built on learning, and actually that the principles that underpin that curriculum have to be those same principles that underpin whatever means of remote education that you have. So sometimes I think we can end up focusing too much on the means, on the quality.
Okay, thank you for that. Jackie, thank you for waiting so patiently.
That's okay. I'm just going into a different area. Elective home education, I just want a quick thing ask about. There has been a significant rise, as we can see from the report, but I'd like to know, does anyone have any concerns about these children? Are we making sure that they're getting high quality education? And are these children falling behind and achieving like their peers? Now, the reason I'm asking this is because with children at home at the moment, and I know my children are in, well, sixth form now, but I know my education would not be able to teach children or even help them to high quality standards. So if people are electing to have children at home at any level, what guidelines do these parents have on what their education of the children should be?
Thank you, Jackie. Dave, is that one for you?
Well, I think Val will pick that up, Councillor Lamb.
Okay.
Yeah, that's for me. Thank you. In terms of elective home education, so absolutely, Jackie, we did see a massive rise when we first were aware of COVID and we went down into lockdown situations. At the current level of elective home education, we have 843 young people that are being electively home educated whose parents have submitted information into the local authority to make us aware of those young people. That is significantly more than is the norm in past years. However, what we are now seeing is a slowdown. So it seems as if all of those families that did have significant anxiety and were actually taking the step to educate at home have now made that submission into the local authority. So the numbers now are steadying out a little bit. And we're also seeing some closures for elective home education. We normally get closures throughout the year, but we are seeing notifications coming in now. I think we've had about 120, 125 notifications now of families who, exactly as you have said, Jackie, have actually looked at it and said, we just can't manage this. And so we're now getting the notifications coming back in. Interestingly, what we have seen is actually that the quality of the plans that parents are submitting into the local authority of the scheme of work for their learner, the quality of those plans have improved significantly. Often we're in a situation within the local authority where we need to go back to families and ask them to review their plans for education because it's not deemed suitable. And then we're in a situation of where we're actually starting then to issue attendance orders. So we do still issue attendance orders, and we are still going down that road where we do not feel that the plans are appropriate and the quality of education that is outlined is appropriate. But I think we've also got to be very aware that whilst a lot of those notifications for elective home education are because of COVID, that is the reason they are giving us, there's also large numbers of families that are making that choice, that they feel that it's the best thing for their child, regardless of the COVID situation or not, and are providing a different educational experience for their learners. And as you'll know, Jackie, councillors, that the actual legislation that sits behind elective home education is one which certainly nationally is being challenged, because the legislation itself does limit the involvement, the engagement from the local authority to actually see those young people and engage with those young people. So there's lots of lobbying going on and reviews of that legislation that is being made to change that picture. However, I can tell you, I can reassure you that we are in contact with all of our families that are being electively home educated. Our attendance team are supporting the elective home education team. We are making regular phone calls. If we're not getting a response, we're doing door knocking, so that we have got a full safeguarding programme that is in place to ensure that they are safe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And then just a very quick final extra hand up from Helen.
Hi, thank you, and I will be quick. And it can just be left out there as a thought for later. It's just on digital devices. My son attends Abbey Grange, and all the children there were given a digital device when they started. Now, I think that they've actually phased that out because they found it difficult to sustain financially. But I think going forward, high schools and maybe upper key stage 2 as well, schools need to be thinking about what devices children have. I mean, I know at the moment we're dealing with the situation as it is, but I think it is something that needs planning for in the future. I didn't need that device. My child didn't need that device, actually. And so if it were means tested or on a basis of children having access to at least one between 2 devices, I think that is something worth thinking about going forward down the line.
Okay, thank you for that, Helen. So that's all the comments. So I'll invite Sal to sum up in a second. One other thing I just felt was appropriate to raise at this point was members will no doubt be aware that the DfE consultation on how GCSE, AS and A-level grades should be awarded in the summer. There was a consultation that closed on the 29th of January, which just didn't fit in with our meeting cycle. So as you know, we asked all members if they wanted to feed in anything specific about that. There was only one board member who took up that offer, so we fed that in directly, and then we just prepared a summary of the previous working group recommendations that we'd made, following on from the letter that we sent to the DfE and Ofqual in the autumn last year. So just so all members are aware that that's what we've done and the approach that we've taken. So the views of Scrutiny were fed into the consultation in that way. Okay, so Sal, did you have any final thoughts or comments you wanted to make on that item overall before we move on?
Sure, thanks, Councillor Lamb. Just briefly, I mean, I think you've heard the full range of responses in terms of the support that we're trying to provide right across the children's services system, and I think you know, your questions and comments have been really helpful to ensure that we're thinking about some of those things that you're pointing us to. So thank you for that. But I also appreciate the tone and approach to the questions, which shows that you understand and appreciate what a challenge this is at this moment in time, but that we are working really hard to make sure we can provide support to those that need it, and we're working in an open and collaborative way, you know, where things aren't within our direct control. It's our you know, we use our relationships, we use the influence that we have to try and steer things in the right direction, so that you know, children and families in the city get the best service possible from right across the system. I know schools is a big one in all of this, and you know, what we have tried to do from the beginning is, no matter what what parameters we're working in, which we do work within in terms of the guidance that comes out, we're continually trying to work to a position where members of the public can have strong confidence in the systems and processes that we have put in place, because once they feel confident, then we'll achieve the best for them in terms of school attendance, in terms of lowering numbers of parents choosing to electively home educate specifically related to COVID. So as Val said, there's a whole host of reasons why parents may choose that, but There are some we know that are directly related to COVID, and so as the confidence from the public in the systems that we've got, in the way that we approach keeping our schools and early year settings open, the more people will feel confident in sending their children in. So thanks for your contributions to that.
Thank you for that, Sal. And I think it goes without saying that the entire board would send our huge admiration and thanks to everybody that's working across the sector for the incredible job that they're doing in the most unprecedented and challenging of circumstances. And I don't think our admiration for them could be any higher. So if you could pass that on behalf of the whole board, we'd be very grateful for that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so if we can move on to item 8, which is an update on thriving the Leeds child poverty strategy. So there is a brief report to go with this. It's been a long-standing item on our work programme to come to this meeting, and Councillor Venner did approach me to see if we might consider pushing it back until later in the year. It's perfectly understandable. There have been a whole variety of staffing changes, and with the pandemic, there's a huge amount of things going on. So I fully accept the reasons that Councillor Venner put that to me, but I do feel it's important as a board that with an issue as important as this, that we do at least take the time to understand where things have got to, what the plan is going forward, and how we are where we are. So I agree that we wouldn't have the same level of report that we would normally have for this kind of item, so that we're not putting too much pressure on the officers to produce that. But I just wanted to have board members to have that context before we start. So I'll ask Councillor Venner to give us an introduction, and then anyone else that wants to chip in, and then we'll go into comments and questions. So Councillor Venner, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So this is a summary of our work on child poverty and our strategy Thrive, which addresses the impact of child poverty in the city. My main reason for asking for the report to come in a couple of months is that we need to report 6 monthly on this work to the Executive Board. So in April, a more detailed report will be going to Executive Board, which will contain monitoring data and case studies. So you could have had a more detailed report later in the year, but obviously we can still return later in the year with a more detailed report if you would like that. But in the meantime, this is a summary. So pre-pandemic, there were just under 34,000 children in Leeds living in poverty, but the Children's Commissioner has estimated that an additional 300,000 children have been pushed into poverty as a direct result of the pandemic. And in Leeds, we have our highest birth rate in our most deprived areas. So Gipton and Hare Hills is the most deprived ward in the city with the highest number of children. And there are really clear links between poverty and growing up in care. You are 10 times more likely to be taken into care if you live in Blackpool compared to Wokingham. So it's an incredibly important agenda. And it's been a key piece of work throughout the pandemic. I chair the Child Poverty Strategy Board, and we got it up and running very quickly into the pandemic. The board contains 6 work streams which are outlined in the report. Some of them have very quantitative, concrete outputs. For example, the longer report I referred to will refer to the number of period products we distribute, the amount of income that's been increased for individual families, so through the work the housing team are doing, and the outcomes of the selective licensing in Beeston and Hare Hills, which is about improving quality of private sector housing. Other work streams like poverty proofing social work are more about ensuring that social work is always done from a poverty aware standpoint, and also that social workers know enough of local services that they're able to connect them up to support families that are in need. There is very much a moral imperative to this work. So We do monitor the efficacy of the work, and we do monitor the work streams. But for example, with Healthy Holidays, which is about ensuring children have meaningful activity and food during the holidays, there's research that, you know, hungry children don't learn very well. So, you know, part of breakfast clubs and making sure that children have enough to eat is making sure they can learn. But even if we couldn't in any way demonstrate that Healthy Holidays directly resulted in improved academic attainment for children, we would still do it, because it's morally wrong that children are hungry. So there's a really strong moral imperative to this work. And it's very frustrating that as a council, we don't have the levers to lift people out of poverty. They very much rest with national government, and there's a cross-party campaign at the moment to keep the additional £20 that's been within universal credit throughout the duration of the pandemic, but is due to be removed again. Sorry about the barking in April. If that carries on, I'll have to shut the kitchen door. But while we don't control the levers to lift people out of poverty, we do have a duty to try and ameliorate the impact of poverty, and that's very much what the board aims to do. The voice of children and young people and families with direct lived experience of poverty are central to the work. We work directly and closely with children and families, and they've helped us come up with the aims that we have and the priorities that we have. We had a Child for Leeds ambassador event. I think it was last year, just before, not long before lockdown, when we were still able to meet in groups. We had an event at Catch and Hare Hills who do a huge amount of work with children in that community, and they delivered the event on child poverty, where they talked directly to ambassadors about their lived experience, and they've devised lots of ways of getting their experience across. For example, a snakes and ladders board game, which is an incredibly powerful and creative way that the children demonstrate the daily impact that poverty has on their lives. This will continue to be a really important piece of work. We anticipate a huge increase in child poverty as a result of the pandemic, and people aged 16 to 25 are the group most economically impacted so far, in terms of they're most likely to have been furloughed, they're most likely to be made redundant. So we are expecting a huge spike in youth unemployment. So I'm really happy to answer questions on this report that is a summary, but we would be really happy to bring a more detailed report with more monitoring data and case studies later in the year when that's been written for executive board. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Venn. I think that will be very welcome to get that that update later in the year. So I've got Councillor Flynn, who's got a question, please.
Yes, thanks, Alan. Fiona, yeah, I understand the situation on why you decided, or why you wanted to delay this slightly. Looking at the paperwork, 4 of the very senior officers were looking at this particular area were allowed to go sort of recently, and I understand all of the reasons behind that, and the Julie and I think one other also looking at it at the moment. I just wondered how quickly you would get permanent new staff in place, you know, head of service or whatever, looking after child poverty, given, you know, the importance of the issue.
Shall I come in?
Yeah, go ahead. I heard a voice there. Was that?
Hi, I'll just come in on that, Councillor Lamb. Councillor Flynn, absolutely. So I've taken over in terms of CFLT and the Children and Families Directorate as lead for the Directorate. We have now identified leads from across the council who will lead the other work streams. So we have Catherine Ingold, who will be leading on Best Start and health and wellbeing. We have Martin Long, who will be leading on housing and provision. Lee Hemsworth, who will be leading on financial health and inclusion. Gerard Tinsdale, who will be leading on transitions and employment. And Farah Khan, who is the principal social worker, will continue to lead on empowering families and safeguarding. So I'm sure all of those names are very familiar because, you know, they're people who have a lot of experience in this area, and I think they'll make a really positive contribution actually to the board. I think it's always positive as well, I think, in our own experience, to have fresh eyes, because I think people will come and look at things through a different lens and bring the experience, their own personal experience and professional experience. So I'm really looking forward to the next board meeting, because I think it will be a really positive discussion.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, you half answered my follow-up question. I think you probably anticipated it. I do know some of the people you just mentioned. Are they sort of fully experienced in this particular area of work, or are they coming into it? I appreciate the new eyes bit, but nothing like a bit of experience.
Absolutely, Councillor Flynn. And yeah, they are really experienced. And to be honest with you, they're all individuals. I think there's one new individual who's from public health, which again, I think is a positive thing. But all of the individuals are individuals who we talk to on a daily basis, because our paths cross in terms of this agenda, and in terms of children and families and communities who are impacted on by poverty. So I think there's a real wealth of experience.
Could I just add to that, Chair? We've never had officers whose sole job was to work on the poverty agenda. We've always had people doing it as part of their work. They've been doing the actual work of trying to ameliorate the impact of poverty as part of their day-to-day work, and also sitting on the board. So some of the work, about 3 of the work stream leads did leave as part of the Early Leavers Initiative. So we've had to identify new people to take their place on the board, which, as Julie said, will bring a fresh approach. But they're not, apart from Catherine, they're not people new to the council, and also they're people who are completely imbued in this work. And you know, I've worked very directly with Gerard in housing around some very desperate situations of homeless, you know, children and parents, and he's responded to that. So these are people with extensive experience of the poverty agenda and working directly with people that they will bring to the board. So although the department, as all departments in the council, has lost some fantastic staff because of the cuts that we've had to make, this agenda is really important, and the people that are working on it have a huge amount of experience that they will bring to the formal board.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Gruen, please.
Thank you. Councillor Venner, I just wanted to pick up on the housing and provision stream of work that you've just commented on. The objective is laudable. We want every family to live in housing that is safe, appropriate and affordable. But I think all of us around this table know just how far away from that we are. And of course, the housing environment that you live in makes a huge difference to a child's experience or anybody's experience from that point of view. And I sometimes wonder whether housing, our own council housing service, recognises that quite as much as it might in their daily toil. And I'm delighted to hear that Gerard is onto this, but I don't, the activity that is described within that work stream on the paper alone isn't going to resolve the problem. So we are going to have to take a much broader and more intense approach to that area. And I can't overemphasize how much I think that does influence the quality of people's lives and their learning.
Yeah, I'd entirely agree with that, Councillor Gruen. Obviously, as also like yourself, being a ward councillor in an inner city ward, where it's always been the case that most of our casework is housing, but that has exploded during the pandemic. That I think we're all experiencing an absolute onslaught of casework around housing, particularly poor quality housing in the private sector. With the work streams, we've been very keen to set objectives that are achievable and to set tasks within the topic that we're looking at. So obviously housing is a massively broad area and of huge importance. But we've wanted to set kind of definable goals rather than saying we'll just improve all housing in a city. We've picked 2 specific areas to work on, one of which is selective licensing and one of which is increasing the income of families. So selective licensing is about improving housing in the private sector in 2 of the most deprived areas of the city, Beeston and Hare Hills. And that's a really specific project about making sure that landlords have licenses that demonstrate that their housing is habitable. Obviously, there are other areas of the city that have housing that's not adequate, but that project is starting with 2 areas. And then the other project is about maximising the income of families. So it's about looking at the benefits that families are on, or the income that they're getting, and whether they're getting everything they're entitled to. And I think the report demonstrates that it's been a considerable amount of income that has increased in total in terms of what that team have been able to achieve. So I really appreciate what you're saying, Councillor Gruen, that it's a much broader area than just the issues that we've picked up on. My experience of our housing team working with them in my portfolio is that they are very aware of the impact of poverty, and I do think Gerard will bring a lot of experience and a lot of very direct experience with families to the work stream.
Could I just add as well? Could I add a little bit more, Councillor Lamb? Just feeding on from what Councillor Venner's said there, and in response to Councillor Gruen. I think whilst there are those two key strands, we've had some real detailed conversations. So as an example, through the licensing scheme, about actually how we can work together as directorates, you know, so although it's one strand of work, actually how do we share information? How do we share that local intelligence? How do people working in the clusters and working in those local areas sharing information where we might identify that there's vulnerable children, you know, living in, you know, in housing where the standards are not as we would want? Actually, how do we work collectively on that? I think we've learned a lot from, you know, and really built on our cross-directorate working over the past 12 months through the pandemic. And I think these work streams are a real opportunity for us to build further on that. And I think it takes us into other directions as well. So as an example, we have the cross-council safeguarding group, you know, which has representatives from the directorates right across the council. And I think where themes are emerging, you know, through this work and other pieces of work, there's a number of forums where we can take those discussions.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I've got Councillor Illingworth next, please.
Well, thank you. Yes, it's an awful subject is this, and it's depressing that we've advanced so little that we're facing this sort of report this time. Can you give us more information about the mechanisms that give rise to poverty? I'm not clear in my mind whether our financial support is globally inadequate, or whether there are gaps in benefit provision that fall on particular families. I have no idea really of the role of drugs, alcohol and so forth in poverty. I have no idea of the quantitative impact of how high housing rents and that type of thing, or whether it's special medical circumstances. It would be good to have a feel for how our social services system isn't working, and to put numbers to it and try and estimate doable objectives for putting it right. And I feel ill-equipped to do it at the moment, though I've obviously met many poor people in my life as a councillor.
Thank you, Councillor. I think just the detail of that will probably come when we discuss this later in the year, because although we could be here for quite some time, I think, on the really important issues there. But I'm sure Councillor Venner will want to respond.
Yes, I will make a couple of points, and it's impossible to talk about child poverty without being overtly political, so I am going to be. So child poverty was massively reduced, you know, under the Blair government, which had a really explicit target to reduce child poverty and introduce things like working family tax credits, Sure Start centres. Child poverty has increased hugely in the last 10 years, and some of the things that have contributed to that are things like the benefit cap that directly impacts, so that limits the amount of benefit a family can claim. I think it's £26,000. So regardless of the size of your family, regardless of your needs, that's the maximum. And similarly, there's a cap on child benefit, so you can only get child benefit for your first 2 children. So things like that really directly impact on children. Also, the government removed the requirement for authorities to have there was a piece of legislation that was to it was an aspiration to, between 2010 and 2020, eradicate child poverty, and in 2016 the government got rid of that target, and also the coalition government got rid of that target and also removed the requirement for the government or local authorities to have a child poverty strategy. So those are some of the things that have contributed to a huge rise that has increased and that is anticipated to increase further in the coming years. But we will put more background detail in the report. But there's a whole, there are lots of things that contribute to child poverty, but there are also things that could make a difference. The reason there is a big campaign that is cross-party about keeping the £20 uplift in universal credit is because that's made a big difference to families. Similarly, removing the benefit cap and removing the limit to child benefit would directly impact on the lives of children. But this is the bit that's frustrating because that's not stuff we have control over.
Okay, thank you for that. Celia, please, next.
Thank you. Yeah, it'd be interesting to get some of those aspects. Very simple, straightforward question there from Councillor Illingworth with quite a detailed answer necessary. And I hope mine's simpler. Regarding the housing, and it's just nothing to do with the licensing, how many council houses are being built in Leeds, if any? Do you know?
Councillor Venner?
I don't know the exact number, but we do have a council house building programme. So there are council houses being built in Leeds. This is obviously a huge factor in why families are struggling. That we used to have, our biggest housing stock used to be social housing, and it is now private sector housing, and that's been a change in recent years. Obviously, the right to buy policy is really significant in that we just lose a huge amount of housing stock. And I think Shelter estimated that for every 10 houses that get sold through right to buy, only one is replaced. So that's hugely diminished the housing stock. I would say we didn't build enough when we were in power as well. So this isn't all the fault of right to buy, but that is hugely significant and contributes to the council losing a huge amount of housing stock every single year. And much of it ends up, about a third of it is in the hands of private landlords. So I've got a number of big estates on my ward, and a third of them are in the hands of private landlords, where tenants are paying more rent than their neighbours and getting a less good service on things like repairs. So the lack of housing stock, and councils have been really limited on how much they can build, because until very recently there was a cap on how much we could borrow. But the lack of housing stock in the social market is a massive feature of why families are living in poor quality rented housing, and why that's now our biggest housing market in Leeds.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Stevenson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to Councillor Flynn's point in terms of the new chief officers, etc., it's welcome to know that there's now some names there that weren't in the report. I'm just a bit concerned regarding, there's obviously a request to postpone bringing this report, and for whatever reason, I'm sure the board would feel that there should probably never be a reason to delay impact of child poverty, etc., for discussion. So, in terms of future, I understand the issues. I'd like to know what handover took place between the outgoing officers and the incoming ones, just to make sure that continuity in practice is there. Was it evidenced anywhere that we could see in terms of that handover? And I mentioned that just because, in case in future there are other changes, perhaps there's lessons we could learn from the past few months. Thanks, Chair.
Chair, if I could come back first, if I could just state, the reason I suggested deferring the report is because you would have had a better report in 2 months. It is not in any way a reflection of either our commitment to ameliorating the impact of poverty, or neither is it a reflection of the fact that the work isn't happening. It was purely, you would have got a more detailed report with some case studies that would have brought it to life and some monitoring. as it is, you've got a summary, and it was actually also, I would add, it was my suggestion that this was an agenda item last year. I suggested that mental health and poverty were going to be the biggest impact of this pandemic on children, and that it would be really good if we could report to you on those. So I am in no way not wanting to report to you on child poverty and what we're doing about it, be accountable to you, and give details of the work that we're doing, but you would have had a better report in 2 months. However, I'm very happy to discuss a summary with you now and bring a detailed report back, but I do not want the board thinking we did not want to report to you on this, we don't want to talk about it, and we don't care passionately about it.
I'm happy to come in too. So just in response to you, Councillor Stevenson, absolutely. So Sue Rumbold, who was the Chief Officer who had responsibility in the Children and Families Directorate for this area of work, was obviously a part of a Children and Families leadership team. So we have regular meetings, we have weekly meetings actually, and at some point daily meetings in terms of a whole range of work that we're involved with, as you can imagine. In addition, I did sit on the last poverty board as a handover. So Sue was present at the board, as was myself, so that I could sit in one board and see the board functioning and hear from the work stream leads. So I think there's been a really good, detailed, robust handover, as you would expect.
Don't labour the point, Chair, and I wasn't suggesting in terms of intention or otherwise. I was just trying to clarify. Earlier in the meeting, we were told the reason for the delay was that Councillor Venner had had referred Chair to the staffing changes as being a reason. I think she just suggested otherwise, which is correct. Are we right, Chair, that the reason explained to you was that there is a delay because there's been staffing changes and they hadn't had time to actually bring this, rather than waiting for any statistical data?
Yes, I've just pulled up the email sent. It was put to me. Give group is how it was put to me. To start a row about it in the meeting, but I just felt it was important that we had a catch up and an understanding of where we are at the moment. I think it'd be welcome to look at it again, and I think going forward it will make sense to get into the cycle that sits with the executive board report, so that our views can be fed into what's going to the executive board. So that's what I would propose that we do going forward. So hopefully everyone's okay with that. So I've got Councillor Forsyth next, please.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for telling us in detail about the new members of the board and their separate work streams, and I fully understand about the need to sort of align this with the executive report. I'm very glad to say that at the end of all reports within the council now there is the section on the climate emergency, and I'm glad that that's sort of fairly detailed here actually. So my question is, within the work streams, who's going to sort of pick up the link, because tackling the climate emergency is one of the 3 pillars, and there needs to be joined up thinking, really.
I'm happy to respond, Councillor Forsyth. So I think for me, I think climate emergency has got to be a feature of all of the work streams. It's it doesn't sit in a silo. It's a golden thread that's got to run through everything. And there are other priorities, equality and diversity as an example, which has got to run through all of the work strands. So I would want to reassure you that that is a feature. It's a feature of the conversation, the discussions that we're having. I think when you've read the report and you've seen the item just in relation to school uniform as an example, and how we're promoting the reuse of school uniform, but the direct link there between climate emergency and also poverty, and actually a real opportunity to address the stigma of poverty, and actually for families to feel empowered, that to feel as an example that through reusing school uniform, using swapping school uniform, having that platform, that actually that is empowering, because it's enabling them to take action on a matter which is dear to a lot of their hearts. So absolutely is central to this whole agenda. Thank you.
Can I just come back very quickly?
Thank you for that. So I think, is there to come in on this? I think we've got everybody. Sal, is there any final comments you wanted to make on this item?
Thanks, Councillor Lamb. I mean, I think I would just go back to emphasising what we're trying to do here, which is to bring people from right across the council to bring some of our activity into focus around managing the impact of poverty on children in the city. And I think it's been well set out that we might not have the levers in terms of actually changing some of the poverty that people suffer, but there is quite a lot to be done around the impact of it and how we support children and families and communities in response to the circumstances that they find themselves in. And so what you will get as we bring, as you've suggested, as we bring forward the more detailed report through Executive Board and back here, is a mixture of quantitative data, but also then case studies and qualitative data about how we are trying to change the approach. So, for example, part of the figure that Councillor Venner quoted in relation to the proportion of children that come into care from given where they are socioeconomically, there are still things that we can do to try and impact on that, and part of that is attitudinal, cultural, in terms of the approach that we take to the work, and our work here in the city that's based on building good quality relationships and trust with children and families to try and create changes, and it, makes a massive difference to that. So many of the approaches that we bring to it will be about trying to impact on practice in terms of what people experience when our staff are engaging with them right across the council, actually. So hopefully what we'll get is a more detailed understanding of the approaches that we're taking to try and tackle some of the quantitative and qualitative issues here, and you'll get a mix of that in the report that comes back.
Okay, thank you for that, Sal. So I think in terms of moving forward, I think there's quite a clear steer on the sort of information that the board would like to look at. I think particularly a lot of the things Councillor Illingworth identified are very important things for us to get an understanding of and to see some figures and numbers to go with that. Obviously, we'll await the reports going to Executive Board. I think is it in April that it's going? Did you say? And then a further update in October. So perhaps the appropriate time for this board to consider it again would be in advance of it going to that October Executive Board meeting, so that we can feed in our comments as well to go alongside that report. And that seems, if everyone's agreeable, a good time to check in on progress again, and it will give everyone time to get settled into their new roles and so on. So is the board happy with that as an approach? Yeah, I'm seeing enthusiastic nods all round. Okay, so we move on to item 9, which is the work schedule. So if I can hand over to Angela just to talk us through that, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. This report presents the latest version of the board's work schedule. As agreed last month, you'll note that the board's March meeting will be focusing on what the potential long-term impacts of COVID-19 will be on children and young people, and considering what actions could be taken by the council and its partners to start addressing and tackling those issues now. Members are also asked to note that as it currently stands, the board's March meeting is scheduled to be its final meeting of this municipal year too. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Angela. And so the final item, item 10, is the date and time of the next meeting, which, as Angela alluded to, is Wednesday the 3rd of March at 10 o'clock, and there's a pre-meeting for all board members at 9:45. So if I can thank everyone again for their fantastic contributions today. We've got through an awful lot of ground there, and a lot of important things. And I think that the next meeting is going to be hugely important about looking at the long-term effects of COVID and what we can potentially do about it. Some of that's been touched on today, but I think that will be a really important session, and getting the voices of children and young people directly, as ever, will be a crucial element of that. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you in a month's time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.